Thank you, Professor Fukuda, for your kind introduction. I'm Shinji Uchida, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this conference. And as Governor Ueda mentioned in his opening remarks, Bank of Japan is conducting the broad perspective review of our monetary policy over the past 25 years. In short, it has been a battle against persistent deflation and a battle with the zero bound. So let me start by giving an overview of the inflation picture during that period. Please look at this chart 1. Japan's deflation started in the late 1990s and continued for 15 years. The average inflation rate was just minus 0.3%. It was mild, but persistent deflation. To tackle this situation, the bank introduced the 2% price stability target and quantitative and qualitative monetary easing, or QQE, in 2013, and later a negative interest rate policy and the yield curve control, or YCC, in 2016. As a result, we succeeded in achieving a situation without deflation, but the average inflation rate was just 0.5%, which fell short of our 2% goal. And recently, as you know, following the global inflation, our inflation rate rose also to around 3%. 3% would be moderate by global standards, but it is high enough for Japanese people to criticize us. A big question is that whether the current change in inflation picture means an irreversible structural change from deflation or just a temporary phenomenon led by global inflation. In this speech, I will try to give an answer to this important question, which has implications for the future courses of our monetary policy as well as Japan's economy. For this, we need to go back to the 90s and explore the causes of Japan's deflation. As background to this deflation from real economy perspective, Japan's economy experienced two things. One is decline in the growth trend, and another is chronic shortages of demand. You can see these in chart 2. The causes of these developments are compound. The most important factor appears to be the bursting of the asset bubble in early 90s. This was followed by financial system turmoil and painful balance sheet adjustment in the corporate sector. Companies had to address excess capacity, excess labor, and debt overhang. Against this backdrop, they became more and more reluctant to take risks and were slow to adjust their operations to the globalization trend brought about by the rises of the emerging economies. As shown in the left-hand panel of this chart, chart 3, the corporate sector turned to a net saving position. The companies invested their limited resources mostly abroad, as shown in the center chart. And this lowered the accumulation of capital stock and the growth rate of labor productivity, and hence the potential growth rate, as shown in the right-hand panel. In this environment, the natural rate of interest rate, R star, declined earlier and to a greater extent than in other countries. Well, it is always difficult to estimate R star, and various models give us different figures ranging from minus 1% to plus 0.5, as you can see in chart 4. But it is safe to say that our R star is low and has been declining over time. Otherwise, we cannot explain what has happened over these decades. And in addition to the bursting of the bubble, the declining and aging population might have affected R star. The impact of demography on R star is not straightforward, even theoretically. R star is often related to the per capita growth rate of GDP. So a declining population itself would not necessarily lower R star if the size of the economy went hand in hand with labor input. But still, a higher dependency ratio should lower per capita growth, as you can see in this chart, chart 5. And to address the problem of dependency, the answer is clear: continue working. A good thing is that senior people are much healthier than before. But the move toward continued employment did not happen until the 2010s. The labor force participation rate of seniors started to rise from 2012, as you can see in chart 6. Japan then experienced a labor shortage situation for the first time since the bursting of the bubble, with the aggressive stimulus to the economy by QQE and other policies. In other words, before then, companies did not have to rely on senior workers. As you know, Japan is a frontrunner among countries with aging populations. In 2019, when Japan hosted the G20 meetings, aging was one of the priority topics. Participants discussed various issues on this topic and reached the natural conclusion: the impact of aging is complicated. When senior citizens reduce savings in their life cycle, R star rises. But if people have strong concerns over the risks associated with increased longevity, younger generations save more, and seniors slow the pace at which they use their savings. I'm not saying that a declining and aging population is a problem by itself. I would rather stress that society appears to have failed or been slow to address this issue properly. For example, Japan has a mandatory pension and health insurance system which should have reduced the necessity to save. In reality, however, people don't have enough trust in these systems as they adopt pay-as-you-go method, and the pace of aging is so rapid. Moreover, we tend to have a negative attitude when we discuss demographic issues. Companies focus on demand side and worry about shrinking domestic markets. Of course, a declining population also means a decline in the labor force. However, the supply side implications were ignored or marginalized during the course of deflation, for good reason, I would say. As you can see in this chart, chart 7, during that period, colored in blue, companies felt that they had more than enough employees. I will return to this issue later. Here, I just want to stress that the labor market is a key. So let's move on to inflation. Actual and expected inflation declined in 90s, stayed low in the 2000s, and then rose somewhat after 2013. And there are two distinctive features in our inflation expectations. First, inflation expectations in Japan have a high positive correlation with growth trend or growth expectations, as you can see in chart 9. And secondly, the formation of medium to long-term inflation expectations is adaptive rather than forward-looking, as shown in chart 10. Of course, these observations are far from ideal. No central banker would welcome them. It means that inflation expectations are not anchored and fluctuate, reflecting real variables and actual inflation rate. Basically, what happened is as follows. In the 90s and 2000s, the inflation rate declined due to chronic demand shortages. the growth trend and R-star declined, and the Bank of Japan's monetary policy, which was mostly conventional at that time and faced with the zero bound constraints, could not sufficiently stimulate demand. Prolonged weak demand prevent inflation rate from rising. So it is natural that people lack faith in the central bank's ability to raise inflation rates. And so inflation expectations remained low. All in all, our monetary policy did not have enough power to lift up the actual and expected inflation under the zero bound constraints. While it would be fair to mention that the policy measures then contributed to protect financial system by providing ample liquidity. And since 2013, we have overcome the zero bound to some extent through the introduction of QQE and YCC. As you can see in chart 12, real interest rates were in negative territory and monetary policy has been very accommodative, even while our star has been low. But 10 more years are needed to give enough stimulus to change the full picture of the economy. Well, so far, I have explained the mechanism by which Japan's economy dropped into deflation and failed to exit from it from the perspective of a central banker. This is the main component of our story, though I'm afraid it may not be particularly interesting from an academic point of view. In the end, it was just a typical story of the zero bound. To paint a complete picture, however, we need to add another set of stories. There is one phenomenon which only Japan has experienced. The mild but persistent deflation created a social norm based on the belief that today's prices and wages will be the same tomorrow. I use the word social. It is not just an economic phenomenon. This chart, chart 13, shows the distribution of inflation rate for all goods and services in the CPI. You can see that most items have concentrated around 0% in Japan. In the United States, the peak was around 2%, and the distribution is much wider compared to Japan. Of course, these figures are before the pandemic and recent global inflation. Well, in Japan, the price-setting behavior based on the belief that there would be no change in prices and wages spread widely among companies and became a kind of norm. They all keep their prices unchanged for fear of losing customers. How does this come to be the norm? Again, the initial trigger was chronic demand shortages. A typical textbook way of handling demand shortages would be to reduce prices, downsize production, and reduce the number of employees in hope of a later recovery. But that was not the case in Japan. There was a strong consensus in society that employment should be maintained as long as possible. Companies continued to hold on to their labor force, and the government helped them by providing various subsidies, furlough programs, and public financing. Okay, as you can see in this chart, chart 14, the unemployment rate was not very high, even at its peak, and we had limited cases of bankruptcy. In short, with government support, companies' labor holding contributed to stabilize the economy and society, but excess labor and excess number of companies remained. On the price front, companies continued to face harsh competition as their rivals were still there. And on wages, employees started to accept reduced wages in exchange for job security. Companies also tried to replace retiring employees with part-time workers. As in this chart, chart 16, price markups declined significantly while wage markdowns increased. These actions by companies and the government measures may have been necessary to avoid social turmoil and prevent a possible deflationary spiral, but they may have slowed the pace of adjustment and prolonged the underlying problems. In our large-scale survey of corporate sector, as mentioned by our governor, companies responded that in the face of harsh competition, they refrained from passing on cost to their customers, as you can see in the left-hand panel. Instead, they tried to cut costs by reducing wages or by asking their suppliers to reduce prices, or they just accepted smaller profit margins, as shown in the right-hand panel. They also argue that under this deflationary norm, it was difficult to move in the direction of making better products and raising prices. As the left-hand panel of this chart 18 shows, more than 70% of respondents favor a future landscape with mild positive price and wage inflation to that with zero inflation. They believe such an environment will make their business easier as they can pass on cost to their customers. They also said that if such a situation is realized, they would invest more and raise wages instead of just cutting costs, as shown in the right-hand panel. These results correspond with some sterilized fact. For the past 25 years, Japanese companies have implemented process innovations that cut costs rather than product innovations that develop new products. This explains and is explained by the decline in markups. Companies did not invest enough in R&D and failed to differentiate their products from their competitors. Well, it is often argued that deflation or deflationary mindset in Japan is a fundamental cause of the slow economic development during that period. Here, you may argue causes and consequences are being confused. You may also argue that relative prices and overall inflation are being mixed up. In theory, of course, change in the relative prices between individual products can happen, even when the overall inflation rate is zero. Companies can raise their relative prices regardless of the overall inflation rate. Basically, I agree. It is difficult to tell whether and through what channels this norm has adversely affected the economy. Well, there are several possible candidates for theoretical explanation of the norm, such as the nominal rigidity of wages and menu costs. Here, I would like to focus on menu cost, as I believe this illustrates some important aspects of what happened during this period. In this chart 19, we can see that the frequency of price changes in Japan declined in the 1990s, especially in the service sector. The frequency of price increases, that is, share prices that saw an upward change, as shown by blue line, declined along with trend inflation. In this context, decline in frequency itself is quite natural, but the extent of the decline is large. And meanwhile, the frequency of price decreases, that is, share prices that saw a downward change, the green line, rose only slightly, even though the trend inflation declined. A salient decline in the former and a modest rise in the latter both suggest that companies have become more reluctant to change their prices. These observations suggest that there have been an increase in menu costs. Companies have refrained from changing prices even when the situation requires it. Although it may sound a little strange, this is just what most Japanese people experienced every day. When the shop owner raised prices, he or she apologized to the customers and tried to explain why the rise was inevitable. Please look at chart 17 again. Based on survey mentioned above, companies responded that they refrained from passing on cost to the prices because, among other things, they were afraid of losing reputations. That is why I use the word social norm to describe this economic phenomenon. Higher menu cost, together with mild inflation, have slowed the pace of price adjustment. And for us, central bank in charge, this requires more effort to get out of this situation. The no change in prices and wages norm worked as if inflation expectations are anchored at 0%. And the gravity towards 0% is stronger than 2% anchor. As you can see, the 0% peak of the distribution of Japan's CPI is much higher than 2% peak seen in that of the United States. Well, two things are required to escape this situation. First, we need to resolve the original causes of deflation, that is, demand shortages and consequent excess labor supply. Secondly, we need to overcome the threshold of menu cost, or more fundamentally, the deflationary norm. As to the first, the QQE and other accommodative monetary policy tools provided powerful stimulus to the economy and, together with government measures, created more than 5 million jobs, mainly for women and seniors. It was basically a high-pressure economic strategy. And chart 21 shows that what happened in the labor market during the period under QQE. In this period, the year-on-year rate of change in employee income was stable at around 2 to 3%. Prior to the pandemic, the increase was driven by a rise in the number of employees, blue bars. But since the pandemic, the increase has been led by a rise in wages, the white bar, given the limited room for additional labor supply of women and seniors. The labor market structure appears to have changed after the pandemic, and wages are likely to continue increasing. In other words, when we started QQE in 2013, there was a considerable slack in the economy. We did not expect this scale of additional labor as much as 5 million coming from women and seniors. Of course, this should be taken as a favorable development in addressing our demographic challenges. And in addition, there was another type of slack, a kind of hidden slack, in which companies continue to provide too many services to their customers for free, which is possible only with an abundant labor force. For example, truck drivers often ask their corporate clients when would be the most convenient time to collect their packages. This kind of service became common and harsh competition among transportation companies. The average loading was said to be 40% of total, which meant that 60% of their cargo space was empty. Faced with severe labor shortages in this sector, this became a pressing issue in society, and the situation has changed gradually. Now, transporters can collect goods according to their own schedule. The Bank of Japan has spent 10 years providing high pressure, aiming to remove all of these slacks in the economy. Another issue we need to address is to overcome the threshold menu cost, or deflationary norm. As an initial response, menu cost appears to have been normalized after the global inflation. Please look at chart 19 again. The frequency of price changes have returned to the levels in the early 90s. And in chart 22, the shape of distribution of the CPI has changed significantly. Now, the distribution is wider and the peak is lower, which is not surprising in the current situation. The question is whether this is a temporary development due to the recent global inflation or an irreversible structural change. I will discuss the issue again shortly, focusing more on the fundamental issues of deflation in all. Well, before I conclude, let me summarize today's explanation in this chart 23. The bursting of asset bubble in the 90s was followed by financial system turmoil and painful balance sheet adjustment in the corporate sector. Companies and society as a whole were slow to address trend in globalization and, more importantly, the declining and aging population. The trend growth rate decline, coupled with chronic demand shortages, particularly in the labor market. Our star also declined due to the lack of animal spirits and the failure to address demographic challenges. On price front, actual and expected inflation declined, and the Bank of Japan's monetary policy did not have enough power to lift them up under the zero bound constraint. Faced with this difficult situation, the consensus in society was that employment should be maintained. Labor hoarding by companies supported by the government contributed to maintaining economic and social stability in exchange for leaving the excess labor and excess numbers of companies. Price markups declined significantly, along with an increase in wage markdowns. No change in prices and wages became the norm. Companies argued that under this deflationary norm, it is difficult to take risks. They proceeded with process innovation rather than product innovations, which affected and was affected by markups. While there might be a confusion of causes with consequences, this was the logic of the approach, and it was this that determined the state of the economy. From 2013, the Bank of Japan started to provide high pressure to the economy under QQE and YCC, which, together with government measures, created millions of jobs, mainly for women and seniors, and gradually changed the labor market conditions, resulting in labor shortages. And the recent global inflation has put final pressure on the deflationary norm. These are the summary of today's explanation. And now, it is time to answer the question I posed at the beginning of this speech. Are these trends irreversible? As I mentioned, two things are needed to change the current situation: resolving the original causes of deflation and overcoming the deflationary norm. As to the first issue, resolving the original causes of deflation, I can confidently answer yes. Labor market conditions have changed structurally and irreversibly. We cannot expect much more labor participation to come from women and seniors. The job participation rate for women in Japan is now higher than that in the United States. Well, to be precise, there is still some more room for supply. Women may work longer hours as full-time workers, and companies are extending the retirement age to keep their labor force. These efforts are reasonable and necessary, but they are not enough to change the overall picture. And as to the second issue, overcoming the deflationary norm, the answer is not so clear. Will companies continue the current price settings behavior even after the cost pressure from global inflation wanes? I think they will. The key, once again, is the labor market. if the structural changes in the labor market continue, companies will have to build business models that generate enough profit and wages to keep and attract employees. And as to the price setting strategy, companies need to rewrite their menus promptly, reflecting their labor costs, while paying due attention to the possible impact on demand for their products. Companies that fail to adapt these circumstances will not survive. And society is beginning to accept these new realities. Consumers have experienced changes of prices over the past 2-3 years and wage increases for 2 years. Shop owners no longer have to apologize because wages and labor costs are increasing everywhere, which benefits their customers as well. In the end, the social norm is said to be dissolved. The main driving force for these developments and long-awaited structure changes is labor shortages. Labor shortages drive individual companies' transformations and the dynamics of the whole economy, while this process entails relatively low transition costs, as it is less likely to give rise to unemployment. Finally, after 10 years of experience under QQE, YCC, and the negative interest rate policy, the Bank of Japan declared in this March that these unconventional policy tools had fulfilled their roles. We returned to a conventional monetary policy framework aiming at a 2% inflation target through the adjustments of short-term policy rate, which means we have overcome the zero lower bound. While we still have a big challenge to anchor the inflation expectations to 2%, the end of the battle is in sight. So I'd like to conclude my speech with this phrase: this time is different. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.